This afternoon, I want to continue several of the themes that were discussed already by our previous speakers, and mostly agree and then in some cases disagree with what's already been said. And I'll break my presentation will focus on Russia. I'll break it into two parts. The first looking at social accountability, which I really mean pensions and medical care and the connection with oil. And then the second part looking at the environmental protection in Russia and its connections with our industry. So as Peter mentioned, Russia has a rather healthy income, with much of it is generated from oil. And of course, much of that oil money can be used by the Kremlin more or less for whatever it wants, and much of the money goes into promoting social welfare in Russia. So it's not exactly a curse in this case. It definitely helps improve Russian living standards. So you can see the rate of growth in Russia has been pretty high up until recently, when now it's about 0%, but there has been strong income. Looking forward, not sure what's going to happen, so there's a real question how much more money is going to be coming in from oil. Obviously, the price goes nothing, so it's not clear if Russia's going to have an optimistic scenario. We have something like 2% growth, or a pessimistic scenario, there's a little stagnation situation. So over time, Russia's been able to use this money to promote social welfare. And one of the key features of Putin's policy is that obviously he was very lucky coming to power in 2000 just as the price of oil was rising and Russian production was quite high, so there was a considerable amount of income. He, to his credit, has managed the money relatively well. In 2004, they set up a stability fund, which was to take a lot of the excess profits from the oil sales and use it for social purposes. In 2008, that stability fund was broken into two pieces: a reserve fund, which is sort of a rainy day fund to cover budget deficits, and the National Welfare Fund, which is to provide for pensions in times when, in tough times when the price of oil is much lower. And so most of that money was supposed to be invested in high-quality foreign bonds and stocks that would generate good income for Russian pensioners. More recently, of course, since about 2009, even before current situation with the sanctions, there's been a lot of pressure to invest that money domestically. So that calls into question how the money is being used, whether it's going to produce good returns that will actually support pensions. But if you look at, and so at the end of August, the National Welfare Fund had a pretty solid $85 billion. So that should be enough to get Russia through short-term problems. And as we can see, during the 2008-2009 crisis, even when the economy was shrinking by as much as 8% in 2008, Russia still was willing to increase pension payments to its pensioners. So it was pretty clear that they were willing to use the money that they had gathered from the oil sales to support people during these times of crisis. And so clearly, one of the main goals of using the rent from oil and gas production in Russia was to improve the quality of life for most Russian citizens, and that's actually been happening. And according to research by Sirami, who's a colleague at Sciences Po, expenditures for social welfare doubled between 2007 and 2010. So welfare benefits were increasing even during those tough economic times. But so there has been considerable improvement in standard of living in Russia, thanks to the oil flows, and since Putin's come to power in 2000. On the other hand, Russia hasn't really done as much as it could with this money, and in terms of improving human development in the country. So if you look, for example, at the Human Development Index and look at Russia's progress, you can see, if we're looking from 1990, sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union to the present, you have a little bit of reform, but it's basically flatlined in recent years and hasn't gotten up to 0.8, 1.0 being the highest you can get. I think Norway is somewhere around 0.94. If you compare Russia, for example, with Poland, which isn't known for having a lot of resources, you can see Poland's done a little bit better, starting at basically the same position in 1990, and now it's slightly over 0.8. So it's, even though it doesn't have the resources, it's managed to improve its human development much more than Russia has. And you can also contrast it with a country like Ukraine, which also doesn't have resources, but its performance has been a little bit worse than the Russian case, so much more corruption there. So as we were discussing earlier, it's not clear if oil helps or hurts, or the lack of, in Russia's case, you have the oil and gas and you've had some progress. In the case of Poland, you don't have the oil and gas, you have more progress. In the case of Ukraine, you don't have the oil and you have less progress. So same, if you want to call it that way, same cause, a variety of different outcomes. But clearly Russia hasn't done as well as Poland, and so I think it's not really a structural problem, it's more a problem of the leadership and the policies that they choose to implement. So on the other hand, if you look at healthcare outcomes, you see a relatively different story. So if you look at, and I'm borrowing these graphs from colleagues at the Alexandria Institute in Helsinki, and they're just publishing an article in our journal, Demokratizacja, which I like to advertise, because I'm the editor. But the next issue, which will be out in a couple of weeks, has a whole section on social policy and Russian environmental policy. So I stole the graphs and tried to promote their article. But if you look at the bottom graph, you can see that Putin put a lot of money into reducing infant mortality. So if you think about what's a nationalist goal that he wants to achieve, it's to have more babies, create more Russians, and improve the Russian population, sort of fight the demographic drop. So if you look at the graph, you can see over time, infant mortality actually dropped in the 90s, but then the situation's been improving, coming close to the United States, Finland, and here's Poland down here, so Russia, where they put their resources, it does have a positive effect. On the other hand, if you look at the top graph, that's male mortality, which is arguably the most important problem facing Russians, but the government hasn't really put any money into it. And so where you see other countries like China, Finland, US, Poland, just sort of, as their GNP increases, the male mortality goes. Guys like me live longer, basically, as the country gets richer. In the case of Russia, you have this loop-de-loop where it's sort of gone down and then around and up and down. So they haven't really been paying attention to that issue, and you can see the consequence. So that clearly, if there's a political reason for putting the money into a healthcare issue, they'll do it. And I think that was probably driven by nationalism and trying to increase the birth rate. Whereas if it's an issue they don't really want to talk about, like male mortality, you don't get the attention to it that you might in a more democratic society where people can raise these issues. So just to conclude that section on pensions and health, the most recent statement coming from President Putin in Milan just last week was that even though the price of oil is dropping, Russia's going to meet all of its commitments to continue pensions and healthcare, that sort of thing. But if you look at what's actually happening in Russia, there's much more money now going into military expenditures, whereas all the social expenditures are being cut. So clearly, Putin's benefited the first 15 years of his rule in the sense that prices of oil were going up and production was strong, and so there was plenty of money to go around for all these different purposes. Now, as the money gets tight, there's going to have to be a choice between which policies, and so it's not clear which way it's really going to go. So let me change gears just a little bit and then focus on the connection between oil and the environment in Russia. So clearly, as we've seen, Russia relies on its taxes for oil and gas to support its social policies and therefore maintain political stability in the country. So I think that connection, that dependence on the oil income and its connection to the political stability lowers the interest of the Russian government in environmental issues. And so even though it's possible that extensive pollution created by Russian industry actually hurts Russians' health, the government's not really interested in reducing that pollution because it wants to keep the industry going. And this is a little surprising in the Russian case because, as we've heard, Russia is not Saudi Arabia. It actually has the resources and the intellectual capacity, human capital, to defend its environment. Because if you listen to Russian scientists, some of whom we work with here at UW, they'll tell you that Russian scientists were the first ones and among the originators of people looking at climate change. You know, long before Al Gore started talking about it, Russians were studying this stuff in Leningrad and St. Petersburg. There was also very strong environmental movements at the end of the Soviet Union, and perhaps they were the ones who helped trigger the collapse of the Soviet Union, but they were very keenly interested in defending different parts of the Russian environment. And even despite the crackdown by the Kremlin today, many of those groups still exist and remain strongly advocating for environmental causes in Russia. And unlike things like human rights and sort of political freedoms, environmental causes are very popular with the Russian people. They always poll well when people are asked about that. However, as with the case in the social welfare issues, the decision makers are very much isolated from these pressure groups that are interested in environmental causes in Russia. And so if you look at the institutional structure of the Russian state for protecting the environment, you'll see it's a bit of a chaotic situation, and that from 1990 till now, the institutions have changed around numerous times. But since 2000, so that there was no equivalent really of the Environmental Protection Agency in Russia. To the extent that it exists, it's now part of the Ministry for Natural Resources. And it's not really clear that a ministry that's first name is Natural Resources and the Environment is really interested in protecting the environment. Is definitely not going to prioritize the environment over resource development. And of course, some companies are making investments in some of the environmental issues, but most of them, that's not their primary objective. And as you can see from the work of people like Alana Wilson-Rowe, there's lots of experts in Russia who have knowledge about all these issues, and they can help create policy alternatives, but they have very little influence on what the decisions are that are made. And so citizen interest groups also have the ability to influence overall policy, and Peter quite rightly mentioned the case of Baikal, where Putin's finger moved the pipeline at a cost of $3 billion away from Lake Baikal, and that clearly was partly for environmental concerns, partly for national concerns of the groups that were organizing. But I was going to use that exact same case for a different reason, which is that this is really the exception that proves the rule, because in most cases, Putin doesn't want it to look like he's being pressured by citizen groups to do anything. And so this one case was, I think, a very well manipulated media maneuver where it seems like the nationalists, the locals, the environmentalists protested, and then Putin, the good king, came along and moved the pipeline away and forced the evil oligarchs and other companies there to pay the price for that. So that happens occasionally, but it's really more the exception. So in most cases, citizens don't really have the kind of influence that they can to push these environmental causes. So I think in general, when we look at the connection between energy, industry, and the environment, the state in Russia uses environmental causes to achieve its own political purposes. And so obviously the most important one was a case mentioned earlier in Sakhalin, where Shell, an international energy company, was developing the gas off the coast of Far East, and that was the only project in Russia where it was all owned by international companies, and there wasn't really any local participation. And so the Russian government said that they were violating environmental norms, and they put a lot of pressure on Shell. And so then when Shell gave a bigger share of the project to Gazprom, suddenly those environmental concerns went away. So clearly they're aware of the environment, they use the environment for their own purposes, but it's not really a genuine concern about protecting the environment. The other case wanted to mention was the Olympics, which my colleague and I are writing a long-expected but still in the process book about. And the main point there is that the Russian government pledged itself to hold the greenest Olympics ever, which is, of course, what every government does before they hold the Olympics. And Kazakhstan is next. I think they might be the winners of the next Winter Olympics 8 years from now. Or China. Kazakhstan or China, the two countries left. But the governments, and this happens in the West too, the governments always say that they're going to have the greenest Olympics ever. And then, in fact, in the case of Russia, they had much of the competition in a national park, which obviously violates the idea of having a green Olympics from the very beginning. But the International Olympic Committee didn't complain too much. So, so the main problem for Russia's pollution is that you have a lot of the infrastructure that's left over from the Soviet era that's continuing to deteriorate, and that causes a lot of pollution. And so it's relatively easy to see what the problems are, and it would be relatively cheap to fix some of them, because there's it would be easy to invest in those areas and just bring in new equipment, and then that would reduce a lot of the pollution that's out there right now. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that could be addressed in Russia to reduce the amount of pollution. Another problem, of course, is that Russia as a country is hugely energy inefficient. So it takes 4 to 5 times as much energy in Russia to produce 1 unit of GDP as it does in most Western countries. So a lot of energy is being wasted there. So just to quickly conclude, I want to leave you with the main points that you can, when you're sleeping on the floor tonight, give you nightmares, if you don't already have nightmares from your aching back, which is that the regime in Russia uses oil and gas income to address social policy issues that it feels are the most necessary for its political survival. And I think those are pensions, first and foremost, but not things like male mortality. So it does obviously improve the life of the citizens, but it's directed for the political purpose of regime survival. It's a primary goal. It also concentrates resources on ideological issues like the birth rate, expanding the Russian population, that kind of thing. And so while it's achieved a lot of goals, these kind of goals, and some success in improving living standards, it hasn't really achieved as much as it could in terms of social welfare outcomes and environmental issues. And here again, to sort of repeat what we were saying earlier, I think the main hindrances are the extensive corruption in the system, the oligarchic nature of the economy, which has sort of been there since the beginning of the post-Soviet system, and the authoritarian style of government. And so those problems in particular make it very difficult for organized interest groups inside Russian society who would push for social policy goals and environmental goals to have much impact on the policy that's actually done. Thank you. Let me leave it at that.